Have you ever noticed that some people leave not because they truly want to end everything? They walk away with a silent expectation that you will call them back. They turn and go while counting every second, waiting for you to pull them back. They choose silence, yet their eyes keep drifting toward the screen. They vanish, quietly hoping you will panic and search for them. And then, when none of that happens, they find themselves caught off guard, because there is one scenario they never truly considered, that you would calmly let them go. Many people assume that a narcissist withdraws because they have genuinely let go, but the reality is not that simple. Sometimes leaving is nothing more than a test. They want to know how much power they still hold. Narcissists are accustomed to being chased because over many years they have carefully built relationships founded on emotional power imbalances. Rather than viewing affection as a two-way connection, where both people give care, respect, and understanding, they tend to see relationships as a resource that serves their own need for validation, attention, and control. When conflict arises, they fall back on familiar tactics, shutting down emotionally, creating distance, deliberately going silent, or even issuing threats to end the relationship. Not necessarily because they want it to end, but because they believe those actions will trigger a predictable response. They wait for the other person to grow anxious, to panic, and to do everything possible to repair things. It is that very act of being chased that they need, proof that they still matter, still hold influence, still occupy the emotional center of someone else's world. Over time, this cycle quietly takes root in the subconscious. Every panicked message sent, every rushed apology offered to smooth things over, every attempt to fix what they themselves caused, all of it silently reinforces the belief that they can orchestrate the emotional atmosphere of a relationship at will. Gradually, the act of being pursued becomes more valuable than any genuine reconciliation. What they seek is not understanding or resolution, but confirmation that they can still draw someone else's attention and emotions toward themselves whenever they choose. This expectation often grows from a deeper need, a hunger for external validation. Beneath the outward appearance of confidence and strength frequently lies a fragile self-esteem, one that constantly needs reassurance from others in order to remain standing. When someone chases after them, that underlying insecurity temporarily subsides, and the image they work so hard to maintain is reinforced once more. Over time, they no longer see being pursued as a possibility, but as something self-evident, something they are entitled to receive, an inevitable reflex that will occur each time they pull away. Part 1. They believed you would come back. Have you ever wondered why some people walk away and yet act as though they are the ones who won? They offer no explanation. They make no attempt to repair things. They don't try to close things out in a mature, measured way. Instead, they create distance, turn cold, or simply disappear with an unsettling sense of calm. But the strange thing is, they don't actually behave like someone who has truly let go. Because somewhere inside, they are still waiting. Waiting for your message. Waiting for the midnight call. Waiting for the long, emotional texts explaining how you feel. Waiting for an apology, even though they were the ones who caused the hurt. And above all, waiting for the moment you prove that you cannot live normally without them. This may sound hard to believe for those who have ever loved sincerely, because when we love, we tend to assume the other person hurts from losing us the same way we hurt from losing them. But in relationships defined by control and emotional manipulation, everything operates very differently. There, what matters is not connection, but power. And that power is not built in a single day. It is built from very small things you may never have noticed. From the very beginning, they were paying attention to how you responded to distance. They observed whether you grew anxious when messages stopped coming. They watched whether you frequently needed reassurance. They recognized just how much you feared losing the connection. You thought you were sharing your vulnerability honestly, but to them, those things were sometimes nothing more than data about what frightened you, what softened you, what could be used to keep you close. That is why many people, after escaping a toxic relationship, look back and realize that nothing changed as suddenly as they once believed. The early signs had been there all along. At first came the overwhelming gestures of affection, words that made you feel more special than anyone else, promises about the future, conversations that stretched on for hours, the feeling that finally someone understood you completely. Then things began to shift, not in ways that were easy to see, but in ways that left you constantly wondering what was happening. One day they were warm, the next, distant. One moment they made you feel deeply loved, the next, they left you doubting yourself. You began trying harder, trying to understand them, trying to be patient, trying to become a better version of yourself. What you didn't realize was that the dynamic had quietly changed. Instead of both of you building a connection together, you had gradually become the one person responsible for the emotional survival of the entire relationship. Every time they pulled away, you were the one who moved closer. Every time they went cold, you were the one who repaired things. Every time tension arose, you were the one who tried to fix it. On the surface, that might look like love, but over time, it created something else. Dependency. Not because you were weak, but because you had been placed in a position where you were always the one keeping the relationship from falling apart. Slowly, you grew accustomed to chasing, explaining, and proving yourself, accustomed to doing more just to receive what was once given so effortlessly. And this is precisely what made them confident, not because they were stronger or more valuable than you, but because they had observed a pattern, one that had repeated long enough for them to believe it would never change. If they withdrew, you would come forward. If they went silent, you would reach out. If they created distance, you would find a way to close it. If they threatened to leave, you would do everything to make them stay. After enough repetitions, they no longer simply hoped you would come back. They expected it. That is a very significant difference. Hope is a wish. Expectation is a certainty. They believed you would come back because you always had. They believed you would apologize because you always did. They believed you would break the silence because you had never been able to endure it. That certainty was what made them feel safe, the belief that they could create distance whenever they wished, and that you would always be the one to fill the void. What they never anticipated was that one day, that pattern would stop working. That one day, instead of running after them, you would stop. Instead of explaining, you would go quiet. Instead of trying to hold on to them, you would begin holding on to yourself. And when that moment arrived, what they had always believed was absolute power would develop its first cracks. Because for the first time in a very long while, they created distance, and no one came running after them. That is the moment the entire story they had been telling themselves began to shake. But to understand why your silence unsettled them so deeply, we must first look more closely at the tool they relied on most to maintain their power. Punishing silence. Part 2. The Trap of Silence. When the subject of silence in a relationship comes up, most people assume it is simply a way to calm down after an argument. Sometimes that is true. Everyone occasionally needs time to settle their emotions before continuing. But in controlling relationships, silence is not so straightforward. It is no longer a space for healing. It becomes a tool, one designed to generate unease, to make you doubt yourself, and to force you to be the one who reaches out first to restore the connection. That is why their silence rarely comes with any explanation. They do not say, "I need a few days to calm down," or "We'll talk again later." Instead, they withdraw emotionally. Messages go unanswered. Conversations are cut off. The familiar warmth suddenly disappears. You can still see them, but it feels as though they are no longer truly there. It is precisely that ambiguity that causes you pain. The human mind is always searching for answers. When none are given, we begin to create our own. Did I say something wrong? Did I hurt them somehow? Am I being too sensitive? The longer you go without a response, the more anxious you become. And the more anxious you become, the more you want to reach out. That is the trap. Because the goal of this silence is not to resolve anything. It is to make you the one who breaks the distance first. When you send the first message, they receive a clear signal. You are still worried, still waiting for them, still within their sphere of influence. Over time, this creates a dangerous pattern. You begin to fear silence more than you fear injustice. You fear losing the connection more than you fear being treated poorly. And you gradually come to accept things you would never have accepted before, simply in exchange for a temporary sense of peace. Some people reach the point where they no longer dare to voice their own needs, no longer dare to ask questions, no longer dare to express their disappointment. Not because they have no feelings, but because they have learned that any form of resistance can trigger another round of silence. And so they censor themselves, swallow what they want to say, minimize the hurt they are feeling, and try to become more agreeable and compliant. But that sacrifice rarely produces a healthier relationship. It only deepens the imbalance, because every time you give in, they become more convinced that the tactic is working. Every time you come running back, they become more certain that they hold the power. Then one day, what they had always counted on no longer comes. The message is never sent. The call never arrives. There are no more lengthy explanations or desperate attempts to pull them back. For the first time, the silence they created does not yield its familiar return. And in that very moment, the thing that once made them feel powerful begins to become the source of their own unease. Because when you no longer react the way you once did, they are forced to face a question they never wanted to answer. What happens if this time you truly are not coming back? And that is the moment the first cracks appear in the sense of self they have spent so long constructing. Part 3. When their ego begins to crack. At first, they do not panic. That is an important thing to understand. When you stop texting, stop explaining, and stop chasing, their initial reaction is usually not fear. It is confidence. They believe it is only a matter of time. They believe you are simply trying to appear strong, that you are waiting for them to make the first move, that eventually you will come back just as you always have before. That belief does not come from nowhere. It is built from the history between the two of you. If in the past you were always the one who repaired things after every conflict, always the one who closed the gap whenever they created it, then in their mind, the pattern has already been established. They do not need to guess. They think they know exactly what comes next. And so the first few days pass, and they remain quite calm. They may even feel a quiet satisfaction. They wait for the phone to light up, for your name to appear on the screen, for proof that they are still the center of your emotional world. But then time keeps moving. 1 day, 2 days, a week, then longer. And what they were waiting for still does not come. This is when things begin to change, not on the outside, but on the inside. What unsettles them is not something you did to them. It is something you did not do at all. No arguments, no accusations, no pleading, no reaction. To most people, indifference might seem like a small thing, but to someone who has grown accustomed to receiving an emotional response from you, it is a deeply uncomfortable experience. Because throughout all this time, your reactions had become a form of validation. Your distress confirmed that they mattered. Your anxiety confirmed that they had influence. Your pursuit confirmed that they still held control. When all of that disappears, a void opens up that they have never felt before. That void is often called an ego wound. On the surface, they may still appear composed, posting cheerful photos, showing up as though life is perfectly fine, doing their best to prove to the world that they are unaffected. But inside, a question begins to emerge. Why haven't they come back? At first, it is only a passing thought. Then it appears more and more frequently. Why haven't they texted? What are they doing? Are they even thinking about me? Have they already moved on? These questions may seem simple, but for someone who has always believed themselves to be irreplaceable, they carry a profound unease. Because for the first time, they are no longer certain. For the first time, things are not unfolding according to the familiar script. And when certainty disappears, anxiety begins to creep in. This is the point at which many people attempt to reclaim control. Not because they have suddenly changed or come to understand your pain, but because they need a reaction, need some sign that they still have influence. Some send messages that appear harmless, a brief question, an unexpected greeting, some excuse to resurface. Others post something hoping you will see it, deliberately trying to stir jealousy, looking for a way to make you feel guilty. Different approaches, but the goal is usually the same. They want to know whether that door is still open. What is telling is that the longer they go without a response, the harder it becomes for them to make sense of what is happening. Because in their inner world, being pursued had always been a given, almost a law of nature. And when that law suddenly disappears, they are forced to confront a reality they do not want to acknowledge. That perhaps you no longer need them. That is the moment the ego begins to crack. Because what they always believed was personal power was, in fact, heavily dependent on your participation. If you are no longer chasing, they are no longer the one being chased. If you are no longer pleading, they are no longer the one granting acceptance. If you are no longer orbiting around them, they are no longer the center of your emotional world. And that is what truly unsettles them. Not losing an argument, but beginning to lose the story they have been telling themselves for so long. That you always needed them, that you would always come back, that they could always control the direction of the relationship. As you continue walking forward without looking back, that story becomes harder and harder to sustain. And in that very moment, the confidence that once made them feel invincible begins to shift into something else entirely. The fear that perhaps this time, they no longer hold the place in your life they always assumed they did. And when that fear takes hold, the entire structure of power they had built begins to tremble at its roots. Part 4. When you no longer need them. There is a truth that many people only come to recognize after passing through the most painful phase. What hurt you most was not them leaving. It was the fear that you could not live well without them. For a long time, you may have believed that you needed them to feel loved, to feel worthy, to feel that your life was complete. That is why every time they created distance, you panicked. Not because the distance itself was so vast, but because it touched something deep inside. The fear of being abandoned, of not being chosen, of losing an important part of yourself. But then something strange began to happen. You survived. The first day was hard. You still checked your phone, still thought about them, still imagined conversations that never took place. But then the second day came, and the third, and the weeks that followed. Little by little, you realized you were still here, still waking up in the morning, still working, still seeing people, still laughing in unexpected moments. Life did not end the way you once feared it would. That realization was what began to change everything. Because the greatest power they ever held over you was not in their words, their appeal, or their ability to manipulate. It lived in your belief that you could not exist without them. When that belief dissolved, the entire structure of power began to collapse with it. This is where true emotional detachment takes shape. Not hatred, not revenge, not a performance of being stronger. It is something far quieter. You no longer spend hours decoding old messages, no longer try to guess what they are thinking, no longer imagine scenarios that would bring them back, no longer put your life on hold in a state of waiting. The attention that once poured entirely toward them begins to turn back toward yourself. You start asking different questions. No longer, how do I get them back? But, why did I accept those things for so long? No longer, what do I need to do to be loved? But, what does healthy love actually look like? That is a profound shift. Because for the first time, the focus is no longer on them. It is on your own healing. During this period, many people realize they spent so much energy holding a relationship together that they forgot to hold themselves together. They traded their peace for attention, traded their self-respect for someone's presence, traded their personal boundaries for hope. And then they understand. No one should have to lose themselves in order to be loved. Real love does not require you to constantly prove your worth. It does not ask you to live in anxiety. It does not make you afraid every time the other person turns cold. Healthy love creates safety, not instability. It creates clarity, not ambiguity. It creates respect, not control. That is why choosing not to beg does not only change your relationship with them, it changes your relationship with yourself. You begin to trust your own ability to stand on your own. You recognize that you can endure loss without losing your dignity. You understand that your worth is not determined by who stays and who leaves. And from that moment, everything becomes different. They may still come back. They may not. They may try to reappear in your life once more. But their power no longer looks the way it once did. Because the person who once feared losing them no longer exists. The person who once came running no longer exists. The person who once placed their entire sense of worth in that person's reactions no longer exists. In their place is someone new. Someone who understands that peace is more valuable than attention, that self-respect matters more than being chosen, and that losing someone who did not respect you was never the greatest loss. Losing yourself was always the greatest loss. When you no longer need them to feel worthy, you have reclaimed something they never wanted you to have, your freedom. And a person who is truly free is one who no longer has to beg for love in order to feel deserving of it. At this point, perhaps it is time to close this topic with one final lesson. After all the analysis of silence, power, control, and the wounds hidden deep within toxic relationships, the most important takeaway may not lie in what happens to the narcissist, but in what happens to you. The greatest lesson is not understanding why they waited for you to beg, or what went on in their mind when you stopped chasing. It is recognizing that your worth should never have been placed in someone else's hands. Your greatest strength does not come from making someone regret losing you. It comes from the moment you stop losing yourself in order to keep someone around. Many people spend too many years trying to be chosen, to be loved, to be acknowledged. But true maturity begins when you understand that healthy love does not require you to beg in order to stay. does not require you to shrink yourself in order to be accepted, and does not require you to trade your self-respect in order to maintain a relationship. If there is one thing most worth remembering after today's video, let it be this. A narcissist does not lose their power when you leave. They lose their power when you no longer need them to feel worthy. And that is the moment you begin to reclaim your life. If the ideas shared in this video brought value to you, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future content on psychology, emotional healing, and personal growth. I would also love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share what resonated with you or gave you the most to reflect on after watching. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. See you in the next video.